All right. Welcome to part 3 of our Platonic Apologetics series we're doing, particularly talking about a debate that was on Telegram between, it was labeled as paganism versus Platonism on a channel called Pagan Revivalism. And we're really going over that debate and things within it that I think were missed opportunities for us to kind of defend Platonism and just sort of the misunderstandings that a lot of people have about Platonism. And we've done 2 already about the opening statements and about some of the objections people have about Plato's Republic and what is the kind of perceived political ideas that he has in there. And today we're going to be talking about the problem of evil and what that means for Platonism and how we understand evil as Platonists. So we're going to listen to the debate a little bit and give some commentary back and forth on it. And this part of it is kind of relatively short. It's maybe only like 15 minutes long, 10, 15 minutes long, where they're talking about the problem of evil, but there's a lot that can be said about it. So I'm going to go into it in probably a lot more detail. And then after that, they start dipping into the forms, and their conversation about the forms is a bit longer. It's almost like 40 minutes. They're really kind of going back and forth about the forms. So we might touch on the forms, we might not. I'm going to see how far or how long it takes to get through the whole idea of evil. And if we want to save the forms for later, we will. If not, then we'll maybe get a little taste of the argument about the forms as well. So let's go ahead and kick this thing off.
Yeah, evil itself doesn't have an ontological reality in Platonism. Um, you know, and the reason why Platonism argues this is partly rational. There's like rational reasons to argue it, and then some of it is just sort of taken on faith that we have faith that ultimately goodness is responsible for everything, and that evil cannot be allowed to have an existence.
So right off the bat, this is a guy by the name of S who's arguing for the Platonic side on evil here. And he is right that we do have this belief that evil doesn't have any ontological being. It does have existence, but it doesn't have being. That's the primary argument that we make on the side of Platonism. We're going to get a lot more into the details of that, but it's kind of a good groundwork to understand where we're coming from when we're talking about evil. Is that things like being are things like the intellect, things that are the primary forms. Really, being is anything that is, for the most part. And we'll get into the analogy a little bit about how that makes sense, because some people hear that and it's easy to think that what we're saying is that the only thing that exists is the good, or the only thing that exists is being, but it's a little more complicated than that.
um, one analogy I use to understand it is by looking at the forms. So, Plato says that like change in itself, even matter in itself, doesn't really exist. It's sort of like the absence of perceiving a form. This is really hard to understand unless you're like really studying the philosophy. But like when you take like a piece of paper, right, and you burn it, paper sort of it undergoes some kind of change, right? The paper is once paper and then it's ash. But when it's ash, it's a form. When it's paper, it's a form. What is the thing that's actually changing? It's matter, but it's really nothingness. Anyway, this is kind of abstract philosophy. To just say that change is just our inability to perceive the good, or I'm sorry, inability to perceive the eternal forms 100%. And then so this is sort of like analogous to evil, where it's like evil is in a way non-existent. It's just our inability to see the good. And then last thing, real quick, and I'll let you refute if you want. But um, Proclus had the argument that like every evil thing that happens because it yields some good in the end. Um, and that's really just the best arguments that Platonism has. Like people are frustrated with this because they're like, well, how can you possibly justify evil? Where it's like, well, if you don't if you don't try to give a justification for it, to say that like ultimately it leads to good, then you're kind of like you're demanding a justification for why there's evil, but then refusing to accept the justification. So that's just the best the Platonism can do. Like, evil is somehow illusory and always returns to the good in the end.
Okay, so this isn't exactly right, and I do agree with that. Proclus does say something along these lines. He has a book that he wrote called "On the Existence of Evils," and it's all right. It's maybe not my. I don't think it's the best explanation for evil that you could give, and it does have, in my opinion, some major flaws. There are flaws in Proclus, even though some people don't want to believe that. But that's a video for another time. But it's not exactly the best description of evil, because if you're going to say something along the lines of, all evils have some good in them, that, they sort of lead you towards the good in some sort of way, what you're essentially saying is that evil doesn't exist. That is what you're saying. You're saying that evils are actually goods, right? And that's not true. Evil, then it really isn't a privation. Then every evil that happens is somehow actually a mysterious, illusory good. And I don't think that's a proper explanation for really what evil is. So I'm going to get into a little bit of a presentation for you guys on this, so we can kind of get into the meat and potatoes of what I'm talking about. So, let me restart my capture here. 1 second. There we go. Okay. So let's just start with this right here. So this is going to be a good sort of look at Platonic metaphysics and how evil and all of this relates to the one and the good and everything. So this is one way that you could kind of conceive the relationship between good and evil. So, you have being, which here, would be representing the intellect and the good, and in some sense the one, but we'll get into that in a little bit. And then on the far reaches, you have this sort of darkness on the edges, which is really the darkness in this picture is non-being or privation. So that, for all intents and purposes, is really what we would consider evil. So, it's non-being. It's also what we call the Chora. It's called matter by Plotinus. And so we do have this kind of dualistic metaphysics in Platonism. Now, that fits into a larger unified framework, but we still do have this understanding of good and evil. So it's not right to say that everything is good, or even that everything leads to the good. Like, even all evils are actually, secret goods. What I think Proclus is really trying to get at in that, which is the right way to think about this, is that even when we're committing evil, like if we're talking about moral evil that an individual is committing, they're committing that evil because of a misunderstanding about what the good is. The idea here is really more that nobody does anything that they think is genuinely evil, right? Even if they do something that would seem horribly, like say you rob a bank or something like that. Okay, it's an obviously evil thing to rob a bank, but the criminal is going to justify that somehow. They're going to justify it to themselves that maybe they deserve the money more than the bank, and it's more theirs than it is the bank's, right? They might justify it that way, or they may have some need for that money that goes beyond, maybe it's to save their own life from a drug deal gone bad or something like that. They owe a bookie or whatever. So they're going to justify it and say, well, yeah, I'm stealing some money, but I'm saving my own life, and my life is a greater good than the bank having money, right? That's really what we mean by that, is that, in all of these cases, people are making a misappropriation of what the good is. They're missing, they're taking like a smaller order good and thinking that it's higher up in the chain than it really is, which typically involves people being very selfish, right? Putting their own personal goodness and goods above a more universal good, right? So this person is willing to steal from a bank, which by extension is stealing from the people who keep their money in that bank, right? So he's stealing from lots and lots of people all at once, and he thinks that that's better than just him personally being impoverished, which really the the better thing would be, no, you alone be impoverished rather than you impoverish a whole group of people for your own benefit, right? So that's a misappropriation of the good. And I think that that's the better understanding of what Proclus is trying to say on the existence of evils, not necessarily that every evil thing that happens is sort of mysteriously turned towards the good. Because as we can see here, there is this darkness, there is this non-being. And so what that means is that there's a gradient from things which are purely good, which would be that thing in the inner circle, which would be really like the intellect or the nous for us, which contains the primary forms, the gods. Those things there are good. They're the closest things to the good, right? And as you go further out, you see this kind of gradient fades into the darkness. There's lots of things that are progressively less good, that are participating less in that goodness until they get to the state of total privation, total darkness, where there's no good left in them at all. But no good left in them at all is that chora, that matter, that non-being, which for us is just nothingness, really. It's like the absence of anything. So there is that sense of evil that we have within our cosmology. So I'll let them continue on. But this is an important primer because this is going to become important in their conversation.
Okay, so there's a couple of takeaways. The first, because it kind of is like a Mott and Bailey approach. And I understand why the Platonists have to do this, because they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's one of those problems that even the Christians and the Muslims and Jews and all of these people who take a monotheistic approach, where the one true all-powerful God trademark sign is all good, all powerful, but evil exists, so what the fuck, right? Now, what they do is that they blame it on a lesser creature, the devil, right? Platonism, by contrast, doesn't have a devil, because there cannot be anything outside of the one and all of its emanations, which is everything, and they participate in the one. So there's an active circle going from the one to its lower emanations and back again.
Right. So there's some truth to this, that, we often say, all things come from the one, one from all from one. But there is still this sense of gradient into non-being here. And so you're going to see pretty quickly here, he's going to try to make this analogy that we're saying everything is good. And that's not at all what we're saying.
Right. And this is called the chain of being in Platonism. So what this purports is either A, evil is good, so a rapist is good, a murderer is good, somebody who destroys pagan iconography, temples, whatever, that's good. Somebody who disagrees and does the opposite of what the gods tell him to do is good. Going against whatever. No matter how big or how small the evils, they're all good. Why? Because evil cannot exist in Platonism.
Right. Okay. So he's starting to form this kind of argument saying that, everything must be good. So that means all the rapists, the murderers, every evil thing that's ever happened is actually a good to us. And that's not what we're saying at all. But what we're saying is in this picture here, you could say the good is like the light parts. And so anything that's within that light is participating in the good to some degree. Even the things at the very fringes, if you look all the way to the edge, right at the sort of edge where the light turns to the total darkness, right? Even there, that little bit of light that is left is still a little piece of the good. And so we could say that of even somebody who commits heinous acts, right? Like he's talking about, that person still participates in the good insofar as they're a being and they still have a body and a form and a soul and bodily integrity and all of that. But they're obviously extremely morally deficient and full of vice. And that's what's causing them to do these evil actions. They're pushing themselves and others further into the reaches of non-being, taking them away from their own goods, right? That's the worst thing. It's like, not only is a person deficient in good in themselves, that's, somebody committing these acts, but they're dragging other people away from their good too, and pulling them closer into this sort of darkness of non-being, of not fulfilling their good. And this is really where we get into the idea of privation, right? That what evil really is an absence of the good. And I think we need to kind of unpack that a little bit, and like what that really means. Because I think a good way to understand it is that something not, evil being an absence of the good means that a particular being is not meeting its fullest potential, right? One of the ways I would think about it is like grades in school. So, if you get an F, what that really means is you're failing to get an A. The expectation is that you get an A in everything, right? And that's fullness of knowledge. That's fullness of knowledge and fullness of being able to test on that knowledge and recall that knowledge. That's what we want to know. That's the fullness of education, you could say, is us hitting A's in all of our work. But we don't always meet that standard, right? A lot of people fail to meet that standard, and they might be some gradation below that, where they're not meeting their full potential of goodness that they could be meeting. And that's where evil comes in. It's the lack of you getting the full potential done. And other people can pull you away from that as well, right? Like if somebody comes and chops my arm off or something like that, that's an evil to me, because, my arm is a part of the fullness of my being. And if you take that from me, then there's a part of my body that I'm missing now, right? And that's an evil to me. And it's a lesser evil, I would say, than privations of the soul, where something like greed or lust, these can be things that are worse things for the soul, because you're not meeting the fullness of your soul, right? The full potential of what your soul can be and do. You're not meeting it. And so there's sort of a gap. And that's really what evil is. It's this gap where you're not meeting the potential of what you ought to be in the fullness of your being. So that's a better description of it, but we'll let him continue on.
Or they say that it is the absence of the good, right? And they use an analogy such as, darkness is the absence of light. And that's what evil is. Evil is just the absence of the form of the good. And we saw a little bit of that in his explanation, in S's explanation here. But that's impossible. And I'll tell you why that's impossible. Because everything is an emanation of the one, and the one is good. So if everything is part of and participating with the one is everywhere. There can never, ever be a separation of an individual who is part of the one and the one itself. In other words, you and your brother are the same. You and a piece of dog shit are the same. And they're all participating in the one goodness.
Okay. So there's a lot there to take a look at. So let's just start with the, analogies that we typically do here for this. So we typically have this, lightness, darkness thing, analogy that we make when we're talking about good and evil. And we need to make a little bit of a separation between being and existence here. So like I was showing before in kind of the light and darkness, you're getting the primary idea there of how we conceive of evil as deficiency, basically, or furtherness from the ultimate fullness of goodness. But, let's take a look at things that don't exist, or things that do exist, or have being or don't have being, let's say. So a shadow is a really good example. So we use a shadow as an analogy to describe this sort of privation or lack of the good, where light is the good in this analogy, and a shadow is the privation where there's an absence of light. And the thing is, shadows exist. we're not saying shadows don't exist. That'd be kind of a crazy thing to say, because they're a phenomenon that we can all experience. We see shadows every single day. Of course, shadows exist. What we're saying is that they don't have being, which means there's no form of a shadow in the intellect. It's not a primal form. It's not really even an intelligible object. It's not really anything in that sense. But it can have existence in our realm, but it has existence because of the darkness in the previous slide, right? It's us observing sort of this edge between being and non-being. And so it creates sort of an illusory type of existence where a shadow exists, we can see it, but its existence is purely contingent upon beings. If that guy in the corner here stops standing there, there's no shadow, right? Light comes right back in. And his shadow, it's not Peter Pan. His shadow is never going to get up and walk away from him, right? That doesn't happen. So it doesn't have any independent existence of its own, or an independent being of its own, I should say. But it does have a phenomenal existence in the sense that we can experience it, we can see it. But we're running into a bigger problem here with the pagan revival guy, which is he's making an argument that might seem like it makes sense, and I can see how certain Platonists would get tripped up about this. So it's something that does need to get addressed, which is that he says the one is analogous to the good, and the one transcends everything, so it's in everything. The one is in all things. Therefore, all things are good. That sounds like it makes sense, but that's not really the right understanding of the good. And then that ends up screwing up his idea of evil and how it relates to that. So let's take a look at a couple quotes here. And I'm going to get my head out of the way so we can read this. So first, let's go through this. And this is from Timaeus. It says Timaeus 50. You can read this. And like I had mentioned before, matter and non-being are the same in Platonism. So when I'm talking about matter and they're talking about matter here, we're not talking about atoms, okay? Today we use the term matter to mean atomic structures. That's not what matter is. Matter is non-being. It's the receptacle of the forms, right? So it's like a field or substrate in our reality. There's probably another video I can make about this, but matter, as we understand it in Platonism, is closer to the way that people understand quantum field theory, where these totally immaterial fields produce matter and reality and all that. But like I said, that's time for another video. But for now, just understand that when we say matter, we're not talking about atoms. We're talking about that privation, that non-being. So this is what we'd be saying to Timaeus. But we must bestir ourselves to explain this matter again, yet more clearly. Now imagine that a man were to model all possible figures out of gold, and were then to proceed without cessation to remodel each of these into every other. Then, if someone were to point out to one of the figures and ask what it is, by far the safest reply in point of truth would be that it is gold. But as for the triangle and all the other figures which were formed in it, one should never describe them as being, seeing that they change even when one is mentioning them. Rather, one should be content if the figure admits of even the title, such like being, applied to it with any safety. And here's the important part. And of the substance which receives all bodies, this is the matter that we're talking about here, this sort of receptacle of being, the Chora, the same account must be given. It must be called always by the same name. For from its own proper quality, it never departs at all, for while it is always receiving all things, nowhere and in no wise does it assume any shape similar to any of the things that enter into it. We'll skip this next part a little bit. And at the end he says, and the figures that enter and depart are copies of those that are always existence, being stamped from them in a fashion marvelous and hard to describe, which we shall investigate hereafter. Okay, so what are we talking about? Why did I bring this quote up? So I'm bringing this quote up to show the relationship between being and non-being. And because this is really essential to the understanding of evil in Platonism, in that what they're saying is that things that exist in this world are some space in between being and non-being. We're not pure being in the sense that we're pure perfection and goodness, like the gods are, right? In the intellect. We're not that. And yet we're not non-being either. We're not, completely devoid of being. We're somewhere in between there. And this is that gradient in the picture that I was showing before. It's like we're in that gradient, which means that there are things that are in our world that are going to participate in goodness and be good. But there's also going to be things that are privations. There's also going to be things that fall away from the good and are getting ever closer to non-being and failing to meet their full potential of being. They're failing to meet their goods. And he relates this to gold, saying, it's kind of like we can shape this thing, this non-being, this matter. It gets shaped and takes on the forms as a receptacle, but it has this share of both, right? It's not necessarily right to say that it's being, because we recognize it's not a pure being. Things are changing constantly. This is really a further explanation of what S was trying to say about change in here. He talks about how change doesn't really exist. And this is kind of what they mean. It's like these things are constantly changing and moving, and we're in between being and non-being, which really essentially means we're somewhere between good and evil in this world. And we can be closer to one or the other. So they go on. This is also in the Timaeus, same passage, just continuing on. And this gets into it much more clearly. What I'm talking about. He says, we must conceive of three kinds: the becoming, that wherein it becomes, and the source wherefrom the becoming is copied and produced. Moreover, it is proper to liken the recipient to the mother, the source to the father, and what is engendered between these two is the offspring. So this is a good thing to hear. This is a core tenet of Romanism, that we understand these three relationships as being essential to the universe. But essentially what we're getting into here is saying that we exist somewhere in between the source of being itself, and becoming, right? And this matter is an essential part of that. So it's really just explaining what I just explained, that we're in between being and non-being in our existence, right? And the substance that we're talking about, this non-being, the evil, essentially, it doesn't have any form of its own. It's formlessness. It's the lack of form, privation, evil. Okay. All right. So this is all in Timaeus 50. And just like I was saying, this form or this formlessness of matter that we're talking about, this privation of evil, is, if we describe her as a kind, invisible, and unshaped, all receptive, and in some most perplexing and most baffling way partaking of the intelligible, we shall describe her truly, right? So I think really what they're explaining here is like what I explained before, when we're talking about how non-being can have this sort of contingent existence. And that's where evil is coming from. It's this sort of contingent existence, but it doesn't have being, right? So just like a shadow has existence, but it doesn't have being, evil also exists, but it doesn't have being. And this is ultimately why Proclus, when he wrote his book on the existence of evils, it would be a pretty short book if he didn't think evil existed. He just would have said it doesn't exist. And that would have been the end of the book. But he's actually explaining why evil exists, right? And explaining that it very much does exist, but it lacks being. So that's the proper Platonic understanding here about evil. And this just kind of gets very much oversimplified in here. So let's jump back and let him go on a little bit more, and then I think we'll have a little bit more to comment on.
But if there's an absence of the one, that means that the one isn't everywhere and isn't everything, meaning that fundamentally all is not one. And it's not good, right? So in other words, it's a nice little fairy tale.
Okay, so that's great. That gives us all the fodder we need for the next part. So he says, well, if that's the case, then that means that the one is not, one or is not good. And yeah, in a way, he's actually tapping into one of the truths of Platonism here. And he's just misunderstanding what we're saying. Like in a lot of ways, we can agree with him. But I think we've got a bigger problem on our hands. And this is going to be something that gets into the problem with the forms here, is he's kind of failing to understand transcendence and immanence in all of this. And so, if we look at transcendence and immanence, and we're talking about something like good and evil, he's trying to say that, well, everything has to be the good, right? Because the one is the good. But the way that we use the term the good in reference to the one is not to mean that the good or the one is a good thing or even necessarily the most good thing. It's kind of a misnomer to even say that it's the good. It's not quite right to do it because we can't really attribute anything to the one. And so when we say that it's the good, what we're really saying is something more akin to it's the source of all things. That's really what we mean when we say it. Not that it's a good thing absent of bad things. It transcends both of them. The one transcends both good and not good. So in the original picture we were looking at with the circle and the darkness, the one transcends all of that. All of that is transcended by the one. It's beyond both being and non-being. And this is S in the argument. He makes this claim, that's correct, that Platonism is really like a dual aspect unity. And I think a better way to describe that is just sort of non-dualism, is that we don't accept that the duality of being and non-being is a real distinction, I guess you could say, at the level of the one. The one transcends all of that. But I think our fellow over at Pagan Revivalism struggles with this concept of transcendence and what it really means. So I put together a little bit of a graphic for this. So in the case of transcendence versus immanence, it's good to look at another kind of binary attribute like shortness or tallness, right? And you can be either short or tall, but height itself is something that transcends both of these things, right? And so it's not right to say that height itself is tall or that height itself is short. And in the relationship here, we're talking about the one, right? And, tallness we could say is like good and shortness is like evil, right? And we're not saying that the one is perfectly good in this sort of sense and that it's only the good. It's beyond that entirely. And this is a major part of later Neoplatonism, but it even has its roots all the way back to Plato. So I mentioned this in another one of our videos, but it's just such a good quote that really blows this entire argument out of the water and just makes it very clear that he doesn't really understand what the good means to Platonism and how we conceive of it in relationship to the one. So this is from Theaetetus 176. And Theodorus says, if Socrates, you could persuade all men of the truth of what you say as you do me, there would be more peace and fewer evils among mankind. And Socrates says, but it's impossible that evils should be done away with, Theodorus, for there must always be something opposed to the good. Okay? So we just heard him say this whole idea about how if the one is the good and the one is everywhere and in everything, then that means everything's good and everything's the same. That means that you and your brother are the same. You're the same as a piece of dog poop. That, rapists are good and people who commit evil are good because it's all just the one, man. But it's very clear from Plato here in Theaetetus that that's not the case. Plato's saying right here, no, there is always something opposed to the good. And that's a part of our ideas, right? So going back again to that first graph that we looked at with the being in the middle and going all the way out to the darkness, that's our conception of the universe. Not that it's all good from end to end. It's not all the white circle in the middle and nothing else. No, we're saying we're on this sort of gradient between good and evil. We absolutely are. And Plotinus makes this really, really clear, which is great. So this is in Aeneid 5:13. Plotinus says, but since it, the one, is the good and not good, it must have nothing in itself, since it did not even have the property of being good. Okay? So this just goes to show his conception of the one is completely off base. And I understand the mistake. Like, I think this is one of those ones I could chalk up to like an honest mistake, because we do often call the one the good. That's something that we do. But what we mean when we say the good is not saying it is just goodness necessarily, in the sense of not evil. And so Plotinus goes on and kind of puts a finer point on this so you understand what I mean. Talking about matter in 2:416, he says, for this reason, even if matter is non-being, it is still being in a way and is identical to privation, if privation is opposition to what is contained in an express principle. So this is, again, just reinforcing that idea that, yes, there is this thing called non-being in our cosmology and our understanding of the universe. It's not all just the good, right? And this non-being is privation, and that privation is evil. Plotinus goes on in 2:416 to tell us exactly that. For what is in need of something but possesses something else might be in between good and evil, if it is balanced in some way between the two. But what is in possession of nothing, inasmuch as it is in a state of poverty, or rather because it is poverty, is necessary evil, right? So this is exactly what I was saying before. We exist somewhere between good and evil, right? We participate in good sometimes. We're always trying to participate in good as much as we can and move towards the good. We all have a natural inclination towards the good. We're not like necessarily evil, right? That's one of the big differences between Platonism and religions like Christianity is, we don't believe in original sin. There's a sort of fallen nature to us being away from the good, but we have this desire for goodness. Even if we muck it up and make a huge mess of it all the time, we still have a desire to bring ourselves closer to the good all the time. But we do exist in this space between being and non-being. And so we're always kind of full of some kind of deficiency. And we're trying to rectify that. But there's deficiencies that we fall into all the time. And these deficiencies are evil. That's what evil is, right? So one way you could look at it is like this. This is the core of what I'm getting at here, is that looking at our original graphic here, being in the center could be represented by the intellect, the forms, the gods. That's the closest thing that we get to good, the things that are sort of the first emanations of the one. So they're the closest things to good. But the more that we span out here, the more we are deficient and the less good that we really are, right? So that's the core thing that I think we're missing here, is that the one is transcending all of these though, right? And that's really where we get into this transcendence concept that I think he's missing. So he wants to basically ascribe the one to just being, ultimate being, pure being, but that's not really what the one is. Being is an emanation of the one, but non-being is there too, right? Non-being is created by being. It's the second thing. It's the dyad. And the one transcends both of those things, like we've seen. So that's really how we conceive of this whole thing. And it sounds a little bit confusing because I think people always want to put Platonism into a box. What he's trying to do is put Platonism into this box of monism and say, well, you guys have this monistic philosophy. And then he describes a philosophy that isn't really Platonism. It's something more akin to really like Advaita Vedanta is a bit closer to it. And really some of the worst forms of Advaita Vedanta that most Hindus wouldn't even really agree with. It's kind of like a simplified or dumbed down version of Advaita Vedanta that he's trying to ascribe to Platonism. Some people even call this like Neo-Advaita, which is really like Western hippie versions of Advaita Vedanta, where it's like, hey, everything's the one, man. We're all one, dude. That kind of philosophy. But as we can see here, that's very much not what we're saying. Platonism has monistic tendencies because we do recognize that everything that has being is one in that sense. There's a oneness to being, right? And all that is, that participates in being, has that quality, right? So there is kind of a monistic aspect to it there. But then we also recognize that there's this thing, non-being, right? And so that's the complete and total lack of being. And so if you look at Platonism that way, we look very dualistic, right? We look like there's being and there's not being, and you could criticize us as being dualists. And sometimes people do criticize Platonism for being dualistic, not to mention things like, there's the body and mind duality that we have, body and soul dualities that we have. So how do we make sense of all of that in Platonism? Well, the reality is we're a non-dual theology. We're not monistic, we're not dualistic, we're non-dualistic. Or the way S described it, I think he said dual aspect unity. I think it's a little bit of a complex term, but really what we're saying is that we're the sort of integration between monism and dualism. So there are these dualistic aspects, there are these monistic aspects, but ultimately transcendence is the thing that's most important. We look to the one and go, the one transcends all duality. So even the dualities that do exist, they do exist. We're not saying they don't exist. They absolutely do. But the one transcends those and unifies them. So from our vantage point, though, we still live in this world that can be very dualistic. And yet through it all, we see a kind of monism in it. So that's really it. And I understand that this is a really complicated point. And that's why I wanted to spend a lot of time with it. Because ultimately, I think we get misunderstood all the time as Platonists for either, getting pushed into the category of being monists, like he's doing for us right now, or sometimes people even accuse us of being dualists. But really, we're beyond both of those ideas. So let's finish it up. I think he has a couple other points that we can comment on.
But it strikes at the heart of Platonism, which asserts that all is one. And we can do this through the forms. So one way that you can picture Platonism is like a prism, right? Everybody's seen the Pink Floyd album, right? Where white light comes in to the prism and is separated into various colors. And this is how the form of, let's say, a tree can produce a palm tree, a pine tree, an oak tree, right? All of these other minuscule forms spread out of the main form. And this goes all the way to one, the good. But here's the thing. In Plato's, goodness gracious, I think it's Parmenides, he says that the one is everything and nothing at the same time.
Yeah. This is exactly right. He's going to kind of use this to try to say something that it doesn't really mean. So keep your ears close on this one. But what does he mean? In the Parmenides, he says that one neither is nor is one. I think that's the part that he's thinking of. And that's true. If we're talking about the one transcending all things, even being and non-being, then that means that the one neither is, meaning the one's not being. He's not saying that the one is being. He's saying the one's beyond being. So it's not being itself, which would be analogous to sort of like pure goodness. And it's not non-being. The one neither is nor is one. So even if we describe it as the one, we're saying we're making a mistake, because we could end up walking away from thinking that the one is analogous to all things. But the one is not the same as all things. The one is what produces all things, is the source of all things, but is not all things, nor is it any one of the things that gets created or emanated, however you want to put it, right? So that's an important distinction that he's going to kind of miss.
In fact, it's even reasonable to suggest that Plato himself didn't even believe in the one.
I just think that's funny. Like, it's just a real bad misreading of Parmenides and what that phrase means. It's, and again, this is why I went on that little tangent about transcendence. I don't know that he understands what transcendence really means, because, he says, well, if it isn't, then that means that Plato didn't even believe in it. He thought it didn't exist. And it's like, no, it's not. He's saying it doesn't exist. He's saying it's not being, right? It's beyond being. And it's fair to say if something's beyond being that it neither is nor is anything, even the one or the good for that matter. It's beyond all of that. That's what transcendence means, right? It's not any one of the things. So like in my tallness, shortness thing I was talking about, it'd be like saying, you know, the one is not tall, right? And he would take this, the pagan revival guy would take it to mean, then it must be short, right? If the one isn't tall, then it must be short. Well, we're talking about something that transcends tallness and shortness, which would be height itself. So in this case, we're talking about being and non-being, and we're saying the one's beyond being. We're not saying it's non-being, right? That's different. There's being and non-being in a duality, but the one is beyond both of those. It's beyond being, it's beyond non-being. That's what that phrase means.
Based off of Parmenides alone. Parmenides has a lot of arguments against the one God of Plato.
And this is another important point to make on all of this, is that we're not Parmenideans, right? Parmenides gets sort of incorporated. A lot of his ideas get incorporated into Platonism. But if you read Parmenides, it's great stuff if you read him directly, not just the Parmenides and Plato. But he's much more of a monist, right? He's a monist when it comes to being. He thinks, you know, being is the only thing that exists, and sort of rejects the concept that we've talked about here of non-being. He thinks non-being is just like a nonsensical term. Whereas in Platonism, we kind of integrate it more and understand that there is this chora, there is this matter, this receptacle of the forms, this receptacle of non-being, right? And so we bring in more dualistic aspects than what Parmenides ever would have allowed for, and then find a way to properly integrate that into the whole.
But there's one other thing, which is the world is illusory. What you see around you, the differences, the change, this is indicative that the world is fake, according to the Platonists.
Okay, so we're going to start getting closer and closer to the forms arguments here, but this is just wrong, right? So everything that we've talked about so far in this, at no point are we saying that things that are different or things that are not the one are fake. Again, this is one of these arguments that's really, he's arguing against Neo-Advaita Vedanta, which is like, you know, hippie Hinduism. That's what he's fighting against. It's a total straw man. Nowhere in Platonism are we ever saying that that differences aren't real, or that they don't exist, or that you don't exist, or I don't exist, or that we're all the same thing and we're all of the exact same substance and our differences are meaningless. At no point are we saying that at all. And, you know, he's basically taking this idea that, you know, Brahman is all things and Maya is the illusion, this idea from Hinduism, and ascribing it to us. But that's one of the core differences between Eastern and Western philosophies. Platonism doesn't accept the idea of Maya or illusion when it comes to reality. We think reality is real, right? And it contains all of these different things. The one transcends it and binds it together and makes it what it is. But we're not saying it's an illusion. We don't have that figure in our belief at all. So, you know, this is just a total straw man where he's, you know, taking these Eastern philosophies and ascribing them to us.
That the world is fake, and therefore anything you do in the world doesn't really matter.
And I mean, that's just a crazy thing to say too, that Platonists are saying that anything you do in the world doesn't matter. I mean, geez, like how much are we talking about virtue constantly? And, you know, that's really one of the things too. Like if we did really believe that everything was just the good and there was no such thing as evil in existence at all, then yeah, there would be no point in there being virtue and us caring about virtue so much. But it's the fact that there is this thing that's opposed to the good that makes virtue so valuable, and why Platonists care about it so much, talk about it constantly.
And furthermore, that if the world is fake, then this comes up with a conundrum, because if all the emanations of the one, so the one creates the nous, and the nous is where the henads, what the Platonists call the gods, live.
But that's not correct. Proclus came up with the idea that henads are beyond intellect. I've got my issues with the head ends, but it's a video for another time. But that's just wrong.
Right.
Okay, can you bracket it there because that's going to get into like a different conversation.
Sure. I'll save it for later.
Okay.
Okay, that pretty much sums up the whole thing. I think at this point, let me look ahead really quick, but I'm pretty sure they just jump into, they're going to basically, S is going to give his response to this stuff, and then they're going to get into the conversation of the forms. And I think that's enough for one day. There's a lot of stuff in here, and I hope this is something that people can go back to and watch a little bit more in detail as far as, you know, what all of this stuff means and try to understand evil as it relates to Platonism. But I think the big thing that we get tripped up on, and this is what the pagan revival guy is getting tripped up on, is this belief that Platonism is monism. And that's really a very simplistic or oversimplification of what's going on in Platonism. There's, like I said, there's monistic aspects, but there's also many aspects that are beyond that are dualistic and then ultimately non-dual. And that's the best way to think about it. It's non-duality, dual aspect. What did he say? Dual aspect unity. That idea. I like that way of describing it. That's a good way to describe it. So that's basically it. That's our concepts of evil. So evil exists. It is the privation of being. It is us moving away from being. We live in a world that does have this kind of good and evil duality in it. We're not saying every single thing is good. It's not ever been a part of Platonism. We can see going all the way back to Plato that there's this concept that there has to be something that opposes the good. And we describe that in a lot of detail. What is it? What is this thing that opposes the good? You know, we can call it evil, we can call it matter, we can call it non-being, but essentially what it ends up being is the lack of being, right? As we move further and further away from true being, from the forms, from the gods, we become less good, less and less good, until there's sort of total privation at the end, right? And that's where we could describe that as being sort of absolute evil in some way, but it's a little different than, you know, having evil being something that is an ontological part of the structure of everything, because it's a lack, it's not a thing. And that's the big difference in Platonism, is we're just saying that there isn't a being somewhere that's producing evil necessarily, right? That evil doesn't have a positive existence, right? It's the lack of something rather than being in itself. And the reason is really clear. Like if evil was a positive thing, that would mean that it does have being. And if it has being, then it has a telos, it has a purpose, it has a meaning, and really it's a part of the good. It is good then. That would be us saying that evil is good. So us pointing out that evil doesn't have being is really us pointing out that it's not good. And that's its defining characteristic. But as something that is just not good, that doesn't mean it has being in itself, right? So evil is really just another word for things that are not good, right? And evil is confusing as a term because that's a positive term. It sounds like we're describing a thing when really we're describing the lack of things. And I think this is really important to our overall understanding of evil, because a lot of people want to try to find a cause for evil. But after everything that we've talked about and everything that we understand about evil now, that it's this privation of being, when somebody actually comes up and asks you something like, well, what is the cause of evils? You know, if we come up with some answer where we say like, well, actually all evils are turned back to the good, or they turn us over to the good. Well, what that means is that evils are good, right? Because they have a cause and they have a telos, they have a purpose that they're leading towards. But that's not really the truth. And anybody who gives an answer like that, you'll find this feeling of dissatisfaction with the answer, you know? And that's, I think the pagan revivalism guy is actually picking up on that. And it's a good thing that he's picking up on it, that's kind of a dissatisfying answer, right? And he's trying to come up with reasons why it's not true. But even though his sort of inclination is right in that way, he's wrong at the end of the day. In where he takes it. But the truth of it is that there is no cause of evil. And Proclus gets into this a bit on the existence of evils. If we say that evil has a cause, then we're saying that evil is a good. But the defining characteristic of evil is that it doesn't have a cause. So part of what makes something evil is the purposelessness of it. That's what we feel when we have evils committed to us, right? If you get robbed or you get maimed or beat up, or any other such awful thing, you have your life ruined, your house burns down, whatever. You can look for causes for it and ask why. And that's what everybody does, right? Something evil happens. You ask why did this happen? And your asking of why did this happen is you looking for a cause. You're looking for a good, right? Because if somebody can come up to you and give you the why of why this horrible thing happened to you, then you can believe it's actually good, right? And we want to believe that it's actually good somehow. But the reality is it isn't. It's the lack of good. And part of the pain and suffering that comes from evil is being separated from a cause. To be mired in something that's just totally purposeless and did you no good, right? You're separated from it. That's what it is. Evil has that power, you could say. I guess not really a power. It's a lack of power, really. But you see what I mean? So I think that that's an important distinction that we should always keep in mind too, is like whenever we're having these arguments with people, is to not try to make evil good. Let evil be evil. Let evil be a privation. And if it really is truly a privation, that means it doesn't truly have a cause, but is rather the lack of cause. But I think that's enough for today. So on the next one, we'll touch into the forms. It's going to be a fun argument. And I think this really should end up being a primer for the next one, because we're going to talk about a lot of the same issues, a lot of the same monism, dualism, transcendence. That's going to be a big part of our conversation on the forums. So don't miss that one. If you've watched this one all the way to the end, definitely check out the next one. We're going to go into that in more detail, and we're really where the forms come into it. So really a bigger discussion about being. We've had a whole discussion now about non-being for the most part. The next one's really going to be about the forms and about being. So have fun. See ya.